My name is Marcus Thompson. After 40 years designing municipal water systems and decoding construction codes until the lines blurred, I thought retirement would mean choosing between fishing and golf, not gearing up for war. I bought 15 acres in Colorado, pristine, paid off, land that had been in my family for decades, and I imagined quiet mornings with coffee and a creek at the back of my property. I did not imagine HOA presidents showing up in a silver BMW to lecture me about fence colors. On the third Tuesday after I moved in, while I watched a family of deer graze near the creek, a BMW rolled up the gravel and parked like it always belonged. A woman stepped out who looked manufactured for suburban leadership. Perfect highlights, trainer brand yoga pants, a power blazer that read, "I make rules," and a smile built from practice. She introduced herself as HOA Kramer, Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association president, and welcomed me with the smoothness of someone who sold certainty and fines as a package. I told her politely that my land was not part of Willowbrook. She smiled wider and told me the fence around my vegetable patch violated community standards. I said the fence was a 4-foot galvanized mesh to keep deer out. She recited requirements from a clipboard like scripture. White vinyl, 6 feet, decorative post caps. It was absurd. My property predated their subdivision by 15 years, and their recorded boundaries stopped at my eastern line. She offered to bring a surveyor to clarify jurisdiction. I agreed because I believed one survey would end the nonsense. 2 weeks later, a certified envelope arrived. $500 fine for an unauthorized fencing installation, plus daily fines after 30 days. When I called the number to argue, DeLea's voice went from syrup to steel. She insisted every property in the area answered to her covenants and suggested I was mistaken about my own deed. She offered to come over with her surveyor again to clarify things. I let her, still thinking a calm, methodical approach would stop it. Her surveyor came, and they spent hours measuring and whispering. At the end, she announced my fence sat on land subject to the association. When I asked to see the evidence, she had none, only the performance of authority. That night, I drove to the county clerk's office with a thermos and patience. I pulled Harold Westbrook's 1987 deed, historic surveys, and Willowbrook's development records. My property boundaries were described by stone monuments, older than modern zoning, clear and unambiguous. Willowbrook's subdivision maps from 2002 stopped at my property line. Then I found the document that changed everything. A March 2003 temporary construction easement, Westbrook property, access route for development phase 2, with an explicit maximum period of 18 months. Phase 2 construction completed in December 2004, according to county certificates. The easement's life expired 20 years earlier. That meant every use of that route since then was unauthorized. The document also required restoration of the land to original conditions when construction finished. Restoration never happened. The route had been left as a convenience, and certain residents, conveniently influential ones, had turned it into a daily shortcut. My lawn had become an unconsenting highway. I kept pulling papers. Environmental impact statements noted the route had been carved to avoid sensitive wetlands and required specific mitigation after use. Traffic impact reports had it listed as temporary access for heavy equipment, not a permanent road. Most telling was Willowbrook's own charter, Article 7, Section 3, stated the association must comply strictly with county regulations and property law, and that violations of easement agreements or trespass onto non-member property could trigger immediate removal of board members and possibly dissolve the association's legal standing. In plain English, the charter itself built the mechanism to punish the very abuses DeLea was committing every morning. Standing in the county office among shelves of brittle paper and stamped envelopes, I felt something like giddy disbelief. 20 years of DeLea driving across my land for convenience and habit now had a visible legal corpse tied to it. Irony was sharp. She lectured me about fences while teaching herself that rules were suggestions. She'd been using the temporary access route as a private road for 2 decades. She had no recorded easement and no legal claim that survived review of the records. On the way back home, I found fresh tire tracks across my back pasture, her route. She trespassed again while I was studying the paperwork. I didn't call the sheriff then. I didn't want a single slap to end the matter. I wanted a solution that would be permanent. Calling law enforcement would be necessary at some point, but I wanted a strategy beyond short-term enforcement. I wanted control of the geography that made her shortcut possible. I started thinking like an engineer again, but now the project scope included legal leverage and long-term prevention. If she had assumed that design documents and county stamps meant nothing, I would buy the thing that made her daily shortcut
once I looked.
Physically
a 50-acre
impossible.
parcel on County Road 847 directly adjacent to my eastern boundary. I had seen the for sale sign earlier. That tract controlled every informal back road and trail leading from Willowbrook to civilization. If I owned it, the shortcut was gone. It was an expensive chess move, $200,000, but it would change every vector on the property map. I called the listing agent, drove to the site that afternoon, and stood on a small rise, watching the land wrap around Willowbrook like a natural knot. The seller, surprised at my immediacy, walked me through floods, hunting history, and the legal access points. There was one lawful entry through a main gate on County Road 847, and everything else were old construction tracks never restored. Those tracks matched the route DeLea had used for years. 2 hours of paperwork later, I left the closing attorney's office with keys and a check transferred. I was the new owner of the 50 acres. I'd bought strategic superiority. That night, as if timed by the universe, DeLea sent me a text demanding I meet at the property line at 8 sharp to resolve this matter. She wanted drama. I wanted to present proof. I prepared my folder, original deeds, certified copies of the 2003 temporary easement, construction certificates, environmental orders, and the Willowbrook Charter Clause. I also prepared for a different kind of statement. I intended to make her trespasses impossible, not merely punishable. Saturday morning, a thermos in hand and documents in the other pocket, I stood by the property line. When the BMW pulled up at 7:59, she stepped out in full armor. Heels, leather briefcase, a crisp blazer, and an air of entitlement. She had brought a surveyor again, the same malaise of professional theater. She marched 6 feet into my land and announced the HOA's intentions, handing me a professionally bound packet of legal analysis asserting prescriptive easement claims and community necessity. It read like purchased confidence, expensive, shiny, and untrue. I asked her on camera to confirm she referred to the old construction route. She did. Then I read the county easement into my recorder. Authorized March 2003, explicit expiration after 18 months, restoration required, development finished in December 2004. I told her every drive since then was criminal trespass. Her face flickered through color degrees while the surveyor, realizing the professional risk, began to back away from manufactured claims. Buying the 50-acre parcel let me checkmate the daily trespass. With control of the land that created the shortcut, practical enforcement became structural. I could place legal barriers, physical gates, and recorded notices tied to my new property's deeds, measures that would prevent future abuse not by threats, but by changes to what was physically possible. I left the meeting knowing the fight was only starting. She would escalate, sending letters, hiring lawyers, orchestrating scene, but now, for the first time, I had both the paperwork and the tactical ground to transform a private animus into a legal collapse. I drove home with the satisfaction rare to men who had lived by drawings and specs. The right tool bought at the right time. The war had begun. I had the evidence, the land, and a plan. The next days would prove whether entitlement could survive when truth, law, and geography all aligned against it. The morning after that tense showdown at the property line, I woke up before sunrise, the kind of instinctive alertness that only comes when you know a storm is on the horizon. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, expecting quiet, but the land itself told a different story. Fresh tire tracks slashed across the damp earth of my back pasture, unmistakably from the same BMW that had been trespassing for years.
The nerve of that woman was astonishing. After showing her certified county records proving she had no legal right to step a foot on my land, she had trespassed again within 12 hours. It wasn't habit anymore. It was entitlement, sharpening into defiance. And while I stared at those tire marks, the first trucks from Fence Right Construction came rattling down County Road 847, carrying steel posts, chain link rolls, and enough equipment to fortify a compound. The timing was perfect. The war she thought she controlled was now turning in my favor, and she had no idea how fast it would go. By mid-morning, as contractors unloaded augers and pallets of fencing, the calm countryside filled with the steady thrum of machinery. Bobby, the construction foreman, walked the perimeter with me, confirming the layout for the 8-foot industrial barrier that would seal off every unauthorized path. He had the easy confidence of a man who'd installed fences before he'd eaten breakfast. And when I explained why I needed this particular project, he just chuckled and said, "I've built fences because of cows, dogs, and crazy neighbors. Yours might be the most expensive neighbor problem I've ever seen." Before we could finish marking the boundary, a silver flash appeared at the end of the road. Her BMW came swinging around the bend at a speed that suggested she believed asphalt and gravel both bow beneath her authority. She slammed the brakes so hard dust billowed like smoke behind her. And then she stepped out, heels stabbing the dirt, blazer sharp enough to cut glass, sunglasses perched like a crown atop a furious queen. From the look on her face, she hadn't expected the sight in front of her. A full crew of contractors turning her beloved shortcut into a fortress she could never breach again. She marched straight toward us, her voice already raised as she demanded to know under what authority this obstruction of community access was taking place. Bobby, unimpressed by her theatrics, simply told her to move her car because it was blocking equipment. She ignored him and turned her anger at me, unleashing a rambling tirade about building codes, county noise regulations, and her influence with the commissioners. Every sentence dripped with desperation disguised as leadership. But what stood out most was that she kept referring to the illegal shortcut as if it were a legally recognized public road. Her fantasy was becoming her reality. When logic failed her, she pulled out her phone and started making calls. County building inspectors, sheriff's office, and some department so obscure even Bobby whispered, "I don't think that's a real office." Each call ended the same way. No violations, all permits were valid, construction lawful. Her frustration grew with each rejection. By noon, the posts were going into the earth, and every thud sounded like a door closing on her imagined authority. She eventually sped off in a swirl of dust, but I knew she'd be back. People like her don't quit. They regroup. The next morning confirmed it. As I checked the northern boundary, I saw tire marks again. Not BMW tracks this time, but a larger vehicle. She'd found a different way through the brush, a desperate attempt to preserve control. It was like watching someone break into a house through the kitchen window after the front door had been locked. So I called Bobby and told him to expand the fencing to cover every possible entry point. He grinned like a man who loved a challenge and doubled his crew's work without a second thought. But Dalia wasn't done. Wednesday afternoon she appeared again, this time armed with a new surveyor carrying equipment and paperwork she claimed updated the recorded boundaries. She waved pages that clearly weren't official county documents, insisting that half my land belonged to Willowbrook Estates due to recent jurisdictional adjustments. When the surveyor compared her papers with my certified deeds, his expression shifted. He quietly packed up his equipment and told her he wouldn't jeopardize his license validating altered documents. Her fury was volcanic. She yelled at him, yelled at me, even yelled at the fence posts, as if metal would suddenly bow to her authority. She left in a storm of threats. Again.
By Thursday morning, she had reached full meltdown. I heard shouting before I even reached the property line. She had arrived with bolt cutters and 2 day laborers, and she was actively cutting into a section of my new fence. Seeing her wrestle with the chain link like she was trying to break out of a prison she had built in her own mind was surreal. Bobby called the sheriff immediately, and when Deputy Rodriguez pulled up, the scene couldn't have been more incriminating. He approached with the calm of a man who dealt with nonsense before and asked the simplest questions. Was this her fence? No. Was this her land? No. Was she cutting the fence? Yes, and the bolt cutters were still in her hands. Rodriguez told her plainly that she was committing criminal mischief and trespass, and if she continued, she'd be arrested. Her response was to shout that she was the HOA president, to which he replied, "Ma'am, that's like being president of a gardening club. It doesn't give you special powers." The workers ran. She left in embarrassment. But something told me she wasn't finished. I was right. Friday morning, she returned with something even more unhinged. A full moving truck loaded with crowbars, pry bars, wooden planks, shovels, an amateur siege arsenal. She directed two exhausted-looking men to physically uproot my fence. Watching them struggle to lift a post set in 200 pounds of concrete would have been hilarious if it wasn't so illegal. That's when I called my attorney, Sarah Kai, and told her to come immediately with her camera. When Sarah arrived, she couldn't believe her eyes. She documented everything: the workers removing posts, the damaged fencing, Delea screaming orders. When Sarah informed the workers they were committing felonies on camera and could face charges, they fled in seconds, leaving tools scattered like battlefield remnants. Delea stayed, still insisting she had a rightful easement. Sarah calmly opened a binder and read out the expired 2003 Temporary Access Agreement, the Restoration Clause, and the Willowbrook Charter Rules stating that trespassing onto non-member land could result in board removal. For the first time, Delea went silent. Sarah then made a call to investigative journalist Rita Walsh. 2 hours later, a news van pulled up, cameras pointed at my property, gathering witness interviews, shots of tire tracks, and clips of the damaged fence. By that night, the story aired statewide. HOA president accused of criminal trespassing and property damage. And the floodgates opened. Willowbrook residents began contacting Sarah with their own accounts: financial irregularities, missing HOA funds, suspicious elections, selective rule enforcement targeting anyone who challenged Delea's power. What had started as a simple fence dispute was now unraveling into something far larger: corruption, manipulation, and years of abuse buried underneath her polished suburban persona. And as the story spread, I realized something. The fence was just the beginning. The real collapse of her reign was still ahead, and Part 3 would be the turning point where the entire HOA would begin to crumble under the weight of her actions.
When the news report aired that Saturday evening, I sat alone in my living room watching Rita Walsh lay out the evidence like a prosecutor delivering an opening statement, and for the first time in weeks, the pressure in my chest eased. The camera showed the torn sections of my fence, the muddy tire tracks carved into my land, Deputy Rodriguez confirming the criminal mischief investigation, and Bobby explaining the construction timeline. But the real blow came when abandoned residents of Willowbrook began stepping forward, one after another, each telling a story that matched a pattern so obvious it was astonishing no one had spoken sooner. Unexplained fines, inflated maintenance fees, lost documents, HOA money going to contractors who somehow also did free work on Delea's property, and ballads from residents who'd moved away years before suddenly appearing during board elections. What had started as a trespassing dispute was mutating into a full-scale exposure of suburban corruption, and as the interviews continued, messages started pouring into my phone from people who had kept quiet for years because they believed resistance was pointless. They weren't praising me, they were relieved, because someone finally had enough proof to crack the shell of her authority, and by Sunday morning, the consequences reached far beyond my fence. I woke to a voicemail from Sarah, her voice sharpened with excitement. The Tennessee State HOA Oversight Commission had seen the broadcast and opened an immediate preliminary inquiry. She told me they'd called her directly, requesting copies of every document we had: the expired easement, recordings, property maps, photos of the damage, and witness statements. They also wanted contact information for Willowbrook residents willing to testify anonymously. While I listened, sipping my coffee, I saw two unmarked county vehicles slowly drive past the entrance of Willowbrook Estates, followed minutes later by another car that parked discreetly across the road. Inspectors were already examining documents, interviewing residents, and reviewing HOA financial files. Delia had spent 8 years building an empire on intimidation and procedural loopholes. Now, the state was pulling at every loose thread. By Monday afternoon, the atmosphere inside Willowbrook must have felt like a building with gas leaking into every corner, silent, invisible, dangerous, because residents were suddenly whispering in groups near their mailboxes, meeting in garages, and taking photos of paperwork they previously ignored. Some even came to my gate and slid manila envelopes under the fence, containing photocopies of old HOA meeting notes, bank statements with suspicious discrepancies, and email printouts showing Delia privately directing contractors to adjust invoices or apply community charges as needed. The more evidence poured in, the clearer the picture became. She hadn't just abused authority, she had weaponized the entire structure of the HOA for personal benefit. The turning point came Tuesday morning. Sarah called again, but this time she sounded stunned. "Marcus, it's worse than we thought," she said. The commission's investigators had discovered that Willowbrook's financial records contained more than inconsistencies. They showed outright embezzlement. Money marked for community upgrades had been rerouted repeatedly into vague administrative costs. Landscaping expenses had quadrupled during years when common areas hadn't been touched. Security monitoring bills had been paid for equipment supposedly installed on every property, except residents swore they'd never received any devices. Meanwhile, receipts from a high-end landscaping company showed 0 invoices billed to Delia's home address for the last 5 years, even though neighbors reported a full crew visiting her property weekly. That alone was damning, but the investigators weren't done digging. By Wednesday, the state issued a formal suspension of Willowbrook's legal standing. Every authority Delia had clung to, fines, violations, enforcement power, covenant interpretation, was instantly frozen. No more letters, no more threats, no more demands. They also placed a temporary receiver in charge of all HOA operations. Delia's reign was over, but the storm around her was just beginning. That afternoon, I received another call from Sarah, this one nearly gleeful. "They're auditing her entire financial history," she said. "And Marcus, they found personal bank deposits that match funds missing from the HOA accounts." My jaw tightened. She wasn't just corrupt, she was a thief. Thursday escalated further when investigators uncovered emails between Delia and a county assessor discussing property valuations. According to the report Sarah read to me, several properties owned by her close friends had seen mysteriously reduced assessments, resulting in lower taxes. Meanwhile, homes of residents who'd opposed her, whether through complaints, votes, or simple disagreements, had seen increases up to 10% with no justification. Manipulated taxes? That wasn't just unethical. That was illegal at the state level, and potentially at the federal level if mail or electronic systems were used to distribute fraudulent assessments. My irritation hardened into something colder. All those years, she'd lectured me about community standards while committing crimes across multiple jurisdictions. Karma was catching up fast, but justice wasn't done yet. Friday morning brought another knock on my door. Deputy Rodriguez stood there, his hat tucked under his arm and a file in his hand. "Mr. Thompson, I thought you'd like to know. The district attorney is filing charges. Criminal mischief, trespassing, destruction of property. The warrant had already been signed." Later that afternoon, police arrived at Willowbrook to serve the arrest order. I didn't witness it directly, but a neighbor's shaky cell phone recording surfaced online that evening, showing Delia in her driveway, shouting at officers as they read her rights. She screamed something about political sabotage, vowed revenge, and claimed to have higher connections, but the officers remained unmoved. They cuffed her, put her in the car, drove her away. The look on her face, caught frame by frame, was a mix of disbelief and humiliation. For the first time, she couldn't talk her way out of consequences. By Sunday morning, Willowbrook was in full revolt. Residents who had lived under her rule for years gathered at the community center, some carrying stacks of documents, others carrying anger they'd repressed for too long. Their voices echoed down the streets as they compared outrageous fines, ridiculous violation notices, and stories of being threatened with lawyers simply for disagreeing. The state-appointed receiver announced a mandatory community meeting for the following weekend to present the findings of the investigation, elect a new board, and address the financial recovery process. Word spread fast, and by Sunday, Rita Walsh had returned to prepare a follow-up report. But the part that struck me most came Tuesday morning when my phone buzzed with a message from one of the investigators. He asked me if I could meet briefly at the commission's field office. When I arrived, he handed me an official notice addressed to me personally. It was a formal statement declaring that the fence violation Delia issued against me was invalid from the moment it was written. All fines were nullified. The HOA had no authority over my property before, during, or after her tenure. He also informed me that I would be reimbursed for all legal costs incurred during the dispute, paid directly from recovered HOA funds. I walked out of that office feeling lighter than I had in months. Still, the most dramatic event was yet to come. Saturday afternoon, the community center was packed wall to wall for the mandatory meeting. Residents who had never attended before sat shoulder to shoulder. The state receiver stepped to the podium and began reading the findings of the investigation. 73 pages of meticulously documented misconduct, embezzlement, tax fraud, unauthorized contracting, ballot manipulation, misallocation of funds. Every sentence tightened the noose around what little remained of Delia's reputation. Some residents gasped. Others cursed. By the time the receiver finished, the room buzzed with rage and relief. Then came the final blow. Federal agencies were opening their own investigation based on the evidence uncovered. Delia wasn't just facing county jail time, she was facing the possibility of federal charges. I sat in the back, watching a community rediscover its voice. They weren't thanking me, they didn't need to. The truth simply needed a spark, and that spark had been a fence. A simple barrier built to keep one woman off land that wasn't hers exposed years of corruption beneath a polished suburban facade. As the room erupted into discussions about rebuilding, reforming, and reclaiming their community, I realized something important. This war had started with me, but it no longer belonged to me alone. The fight had become theirs, and they were finally ready to win it.
The week following the explosive community meeting felt strangely calm on my property, as if the land itself was taking a breath after months of chaos. The contractors wrapped up the final sections of my 50-acre perimeter, welding the last steel plates onto the main gate, tightening barbed wire, and installing the final motion sensors that blinked red in the early dawn light. By then, Willowbrook Estates was living a completely different reality. The HOA no longer had authority. Its accounts were frozen, and the state receiver controlled every operational decision. Residents who once avoided eye contact now waved at me from a distance, some even stopping at the edge of the newly fortified fence to say thank you. But the real storm was brewing inside the county offices, where investigators were piecing together the full scope of Delia Kramer's empire. An empire built on lies, manipulation, and stolen resources. What started as a fence dispute now read like a criminal textbook. Embezzlement, ballot manipulation, tax fraud, property rights violations, and perhaps the most telling crime of all, a consistent pattern of entitlement so extreme it collapsed under the weight of its own fiction. By Monday morning, Sarah called me with a tone I recognized as "brace yourself." The Tennessee State HOA Oversight Commission had completed their preliminary findings and were preparing to hand everything over to the district attorney along with recommendations for federal involvement. She said Delia's actions might qualify as part of an ongoing criminal enterprise, which is lawyer speak for racketeering. I walked out onto my porch, staring at the rolling hills and the towering fence posts, thinking how unbelievable it was that a simple gardening fence had uncovered something so massive. Sarah wasn't done. She told me investigators had found evidence that Delia used HOA funds to host private parties, pay for personal travel, and even remodel parts of her home. Contractors had been pressured to give her discounted services or free upgrades in exchange for long-term HOA contracts at inflated rates. Some of them came forward voluntarily, sharing emails where Delia instructed them to adjust invoices to meet community standards, which was her coded way of saying, "inflate charges so I can skim off the top." She had created a system where fear kept residents silent and greed kept her benefactors loyal. But that system was cracking everywhere. On Tuesday, Willowbrook was swarmed by reporters. Cameras lined the entrance, snapping photos of residents carrying boxes of old paperwork, as if the entire subdivision had been converted into one giant crime scene. People who once followed Delia's every rule were now eager to expose every questionable fee she'd ever created. It felt like watching a dam burst. Anger that had been trapped for years was suddenly flooding the streets. Some residents discovered they'd paid thousands in bogus fines. Others realized their complaints about common area maintenance had been ignored because Delia had pocketed the maintenance budget. But the most heartbreaking were the elderly couples who admitted they'd given up trying to argue with her because they were afraid of losing their homes. Hearing that made my jaw tighten. A leader abusing power is bad enough. A leader who targets those who can't fight back is something else entirely. By Wednesday afternoon, the state receiver announced an emergency audit meeting. It wasn't mandatory, but merely the entire community showed up anyway, filling the community center with anxious residents and stacks of documents. I didn't attend. It wasn't my neighborhood after all, but I heard everything from Sarah later. The meeting painted a picture of an HOA stripped bare. The financial records were worse than expected. Over $400,000 of community funds had vanished over 3 years, funneled into untraceable accounts or disguised through fraudulent vendor contracts. HOA officers who once stood proudly beside Delia now claimed ignorance, insisting they'd only signed documents because she pressured them to. But investigators weren't buying it. Some had signed off on budgets they'd never reviewed, approved contracts they'd never seen, and handed over authority they never should have given. The entire board was being removed and barred from holding any future HOA positions in the state. Thursday morning brought a quiet moment, rare these days, until I heard tires crunching up the gravel road toward my gate. It wasn't the BMW. It was a gray USV with tinted windows and a government plate. A man stepped out, introduced himself as a federal investigator, and asked if I had time to answer a few questions related to ongoing interstate financial inquiries. That phrase alone told me everything. This was no longer just a state matter. This had crossed into federal territory. He wanted copies of the footage my security cameras had captured, particularly recordings from the day Delia cut my fence and attempted to direct workers to uproot posts. He explained that her actions could tie into federal property damage statutes if she'd used mail or electronic communications to orchestrate any part of the crime. Considering the number of certified letters she had mailed me, along with the emails she'd sent to her board, it wasn't a stretch. I handed everything over. That night, Sarah called again. Federal investigators had uncovered something shocking. Delia had used HOA funds to pay property taxes on a piece of land in another state. The land wasn't in her name, but in the name of a business she controlled. That meant she'd been moving stolen funds across state lines. Mail fraud, wire fraud, interstate financial crime, the kind of charges that don't end with fines, they end with prison sentences measured in decades. As Sarah explained each detail, my mind drifted back to that first meeting, her stepping out of the BMW, clipboard in hand, lecturing me about fence aesthetics. How small that moment seemed now, compared to the magnitude of what had been uncovered. She hadn't been a strict HOA president. She had been running a miniature criminal empire in broad daylight, disguised as suburban leadership. Friday morning delivered the final blow. Rita Walsh returned to broadcast the follow-up story live from Willowbrook's entrance. She summarized the charges, detailed the financial crimes, interviewed residents who now felt liberated, and ended her segment by stating, "This case stands as a reminder that local leadership without transparency can turn into unchecked power, and unchecked power into corruption." Her words echoed what I'd felt for months. Then she said something that made me pause. The investigation began with a trespassing complaint filed by a nearby landowner who uncovered records dating back to 1987. She didn't say my name, but she didn't need to. People knew. By Saturday, the community center hosted the long-awaited election. The state receiver moderated as residents nominated neighbors they trusted. No politics, no manipulation, no intimidation. Honest votes counted on paper, reviewed by independent auditors. New leadership emerged, people determined to repair the damage, rebuild trust, and return Willowbrook to the peaceful place it once was. And even though I wasn't part of their neighborhood, they extended a formal thank you through Sarah. They wanted to meet me. They wanted to support my legal case. They wanted to help repair the fence Delia damaged. Their gratitude felt genuine. But the real story wasn't the thanks. It was the realization that sometimes the biggest battles in life begin with something as simple as refusing to accept a lie someone forces on you. Delia's lies had grown into a system. My refusal to bend had cracked it open. And now that the system was collapsing, the truth was spilling everywhere. Part 4 closed with the understanding that the war was no longer just between me and Delia. It had become a reckoning, one that reshaped an entire community and dragged a suburban dictator into the harsh light of real accountability.
The week after Willowbrook elected their new temporary board, a strange calm settled over the entire subdivision, an uneasy silence that always follows after a storm tears through a town. The fences stood finished, the gates locked, the cameras blinking methodically like mechanical sentries. For the first time since I moved in, I woke up without expecting the sound of a BMW engine grinding across my property. The land, at last, felt like it belonged to me again. Yet peace didn't mean the story was over. In fact, the deeper consequences of everything Delia had done were just beginning to surface. And the farther investigators dug, the more disturbing and bizarre the revelations became. While Willowbrook residents tried to rebuild the shattered framework of their community, the state and federal investigators were reconstructing an entirely different picture. Not just mismanagement, but years of calculated abuse stitched through bureaucratic manipulation and personal ambition. And as much as I wanted to return to quiet mornings, the echo of that investigation kept pulling me back into the center of a story far bigger than my fence. On Monday morning, Sarah arrived at my property with a stack of documents thicker than a telephone book. She dropped them onto my kitchen table inside. "Everything's shifting fast," she said. The documents contained the full preliminary findings the state had compiled on Willowbrook's financial discrepancies. As I flipped through page after page, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. It wasn't the numbers themselves. It was the consistency. Every year, nearly identical sums had been siphoned through fake maintenance invoices. Every year, tens of thousands vanished under utility adjustments and seasonal landscaping increases. And most of those transactions coincided precisely with renovations done at Delia's home, travel receipts, even tuition payments for a niece she claimed to be sponsoring independently. What stunned me most was how long it had gone on without question. But Sarah explained something crucial. HOAs operate like micro-governments with almost no oversight. They collect money, enforce rules, and manage community property, but unless residents demand transparency, the system largely operates on trust. And trust was the exact thing Delia had weaponized. By Wednesday, that trust was collapsing under the weight of dozens of testimonies flooding into the commission office. People had stories, big, small, petty, heartbreaking. One elderly couple recounted being fined for having a cracked flower pot, but when they asked to appeal, their request was never received, although they had photos showing they dropped it off. Another resident had been forced to repaint his home twice because the shade of beige did not match the community palette, only to later find out that the palette was something Delia invented. A disabled veteran recalled how she threatened him with legal action because he left a trash can by the curb for an extra day. Each story added another thread to the tapestry of her reign, and every thread matched what investigators already suspected. She had treated the HOA like a personal kingdom, and the residents were subjects expected to obey without question. While all this unraveling happened, the federal agents kept digging into the more serious allegations. They returned to my property on Thursday, requesting additional footage from my security system, especially from areas near the Eastern Trail where she trespassed repeatedly. They explained that the Department of Justice had opened a parallel inquiry because funds had crossed state lines and because the mail and electronic records used to enforce her fraudulent violations could fall under federal statutes. One agent told me privately that her case had the hallmarks of someone who believed they were untouchable.
He said, "People like her always slip up. They get comfortable. They get arrogant. And then they get caught because they think the law doesn't apply to them." I couldn't disagree. On Friday, things escalated dramatically. Willowbrook's interim board reached out to me formally, an invitation to meet at the community center to discuss the next steps for the emergency access issue that started all this trouble. They weren't hostile. They weren't demanding. They were apologetic. The letter acknowledged what had happened and said they wanted to rectify the long-standing problem of traffic flow that had led to residents using the illegal shortcut in the first place. They asked if I'd be willing to discuss a lawful, properly surveyed, mutually beneficial agreement. The contrast was startling. For months, dealing with Willowbrook meant confrontation, manipulation, or hostility. Now they were approaching like adults, seeking solutions. Saturday afternoon, I drove to the community center. The parking lot was filled with residents, some curious, some embarrassed, some hopeful. When I walked in, a hush settled over the room. I wasn't their neighbor, but I had become a sort of symbol of everything they had endured. The interim board members greeted me warmly and explained they were working closely with the county to redesign the problematic intersection that caused the traffic shortcuts in the first place. A turning lane, a traffic light, and new signage had already been approved. They wanted to eliminate the root cause that had allowed someone like Dalia to justify illegal access in the name of community convenience. And they made a proposal. Instead of requesting permanent access through my property, they asked if I'd consider a tightly controlled emergency route, only for fire, EMTs, and evacuation purposes. They offered a fully legal, fully insured, professionally surveyed contract with opt-out clauses. No entitlement, no demands, no presumption of authority. It was the first reasonable request I'd heard since I moved in. I told them I'd think about it, and I did, for a long time. When I went home that evening, I walked the perimeter of my land in the fading light, reflecting on everything that had happened. The fence around my property stood tall and rigid against the twilight, a silent monument to the battle I never asked for, but had been forced to fight. Part of me wanted to shut the world out and let Willowbrook deal with itself. But the other part, the part that spent 40 years designing systems meant to help people, could see the value in a legitimate emergency route. If done under proper legal boundaries, it could save lives one day. It could fix a problem without sacrificing my rights. The difference between what they asked and what Dalia demanded was simple: respect. And respect mattered. But the next morning delivered a shock none of us saw coming. My phone buzzed with a message from Sarah that simply read, "Call me. Urgent." When I did, her voice was tight. The DA's office had completed their review, and they weren't just charging Dalia with the earlier counts of trespassing and property destruction. They were adding charges of fraud, embezzlement, tax manipulation, and criminal conspiracy. But then came the biggest revelation. They were also investigating multiple past HOA presidencies she'd held in other states. Complaints had followed her everywhere she went, but she always moved just before consequences caught up to her. Tennessee was the first place where someone had stood their ground long enough to expose her pattern. Late that afternoon, I drove past Willowbrook's entrance to see a small crowd gathered. A state vehicle was parked there, and residents lined the sidewalk, whispering. They weren't angry this time. They weren't confused. They were stunned. The state receiver had posted an official notice. Due to significant criminal activity identified among former HOA officers, Willowbrook Estates will undergo complete structural reformation under state guidance. All prior HOA actions are suspended indefinitely. Refunds for unlawful fines will be issued. Criminal investigations are ongoing. The war was nearing its final chapter, but it wasn't over yet. The fall of a tyrant doesn't end with handcuffs. It ends with rebuilding what she broke. And Willowbrook was only beginning that journey. Part 5 closed with a sense of transition. The chaos that had consumed months of my life was turning into something else. Structure, reform, accountability. But even as peace settled, the echoes of everything that happened still clung to the edges of my land. The next chapter would bring the decisive blows, federal court proceedings, and the rebuilding of an entire community from the ashes of corruption.
The next few weeks unfolded with the slow, heavy inevitability of a courtroom drama gaining momentum, and although my land was finally quiet, the rest of the county buzzed like a disturbed beehive. Every day brought new updates, some whispered cautiously by neighbors, others delivered bluntly by Sarah or reported on the evening news. The deeper investigators dug, the wider the circle of corruption spread, and the more astonishing it became that one woman had wielded so much unchecked power for so long. Meanwhile, Willowbrook Estates tried desperately to regain some sense of normalcy, but normal had been shattered beyond simple repair. Walking past their entrance, with its fresh temporary signage and taped-up notices, felt like passing the ruins of a fallen empire. And in a way, it was. It was Monday when the first major break occurred. I had just finished tightening the final security locks on the eastern gate, more for my own peace of mind than necessity, when Sarah called. She sounded breathless, the kind of breathlessness that comes when a lawyer hears something so big she has to sit down before saying it aloud. "Marcus," she said, "the FBI is officially stepping in." I leaned against the fence, watching a hawk circle above the tree line as she explained. The federal investigation, which had been simmering in the background, had just escalated after they traced a series of suspicious financial transfers that originated from Willowbrook's HOA accounts but ended in investment portfolios belonging to a business front connected to Delea's cousin. The transfers spanned 3 states. That wasn't mismanagement or incompetence, that was organized fraud, federal fraud. Too big for local prosecutors, too complex for state authorities alone. According to Sarah, the FBI wanted every document, every recording, every timestamp I'd collected. My fence had become evidence in a federal case. The irony was almost poetic. By Wednesday, the media frenzy intensified. Rita Walsh aired a special segment tracing the timeline of Delea's leadership across multiple communities. Each HOA she'd presided over carried the same pattern: rising fees, disappearing funds, sudden resignations, and residents who claimed they felt bullied, silenced, or pressured. But in every previous town, she had left just before the evidence grew too loud. Tennessee, however, wasn't going to let her slip away. She was out on bail, confined to the state, and required to surrender her passports. And although she was physically gone from Willowbrook, her home sitting dark and abandoned, her shadow still stretched across every corner of the community. Meanwhile, Willowbrook residents continued to dig through old paperwork, voicemails, and computer files. One afternoon, the interim president, a soft-spoken man named Thomas, called and asked if I could come to a community meeting. He wanted me to witness something. Curiosity and a sense of responsibility pulled me there. When I entered the community center, the room was packed with residents holding everything from old violation letters to security camera pictures of suspicious nighttime deliveries made to Delea's home. Thomas cleared his throat and announced that they had discovered an off-the-record HOA account that had never been disclosed to residents. The account contained over $90,000 in deposits collected through special assessment fees she claimed were mandatory. That money, it turned out, had never gone toward community improvements. The gasp that rippled across the room was raw, wounded, and furious. Some residents had lived on fixed incomes. Some had struggled to pay those assessments. The betrayal cut deeper than any fence line dispute. Though I wasn't a resident, watching them unpack years of deception made something twist inside me. I had seen the tip of the iceberg, but they had lived beneath it. It made me grateful I'd fought from the beginning instead of submitting to her demands. And it strengthened my resolve for the battle still ahead. On Thursday morning, things took another unexpected turn. A black government SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped 2 federal agents, not the ones I met earlier, but higher-ranking ones wearing expressions carved from stone. They were polite but serious, requesting copies of every recorded interaction I'd had with Delea, including the day she brought forged boundary documents and the moment she cut my fence. They explained that her attempt to fabricate property lines wasn't just local fraud.
It constituted falsifying geographic records, which could be treated as a federal offense if used in any official capacity. That included HOA filings, developer contracts, or county presentations, and she had used them in all three. After handing over the files, I asked the question that had lingered in my mind for weeks. What's going to happen to her? One agent exchanged a glance with the other before responding. If everything we suspect is confirmed, he said, she could be facing between 15 and 25 years in federal prison. I exhaled slowly. It wasn't joy I felt, not satisfaction or revenge. It was relief. Relief that no one else would be bullied by her authority. Relief that justice, slow as it sometimes is, had woken up and started moving. Meanwhile, Willowbrook was rebuilding itself. The interim board met with county officials almost daily, drafting new bylaws, restructuring financial protocols, implementing strict transparency rules, and designing a long-term accountability system. They even hired independent auditors to supervise every monetary decision for the next 2 years. For the first time, the HOA was actually functioning like an organization meant to serve people rather than dominate them. Residents who once avoided meetings now attended them enthusiastically, eager to reclaim control over their neighborhood. But the most surprising development came the next weekend. The interim board reached out again, this time with a proposal more meaningful than any meeting. They had finalized plans for the county-backed road improvement project. Better signage, a turning lane, and new traffic controls would permanently eliminate the bottleneck that had made residents rely on the illegal shortcut through my land. Then they asked if I would consider something more, partnering with them to create a community emergency access route on my newly purchased 50 acres. The difference between their request and everything DeLea had ever done was stark. They didn't demand it, they didn't assume it, they didn't pressure or manipulate. They asked respectfully, offered fair compensation, and included a fully legal opt-out clause. They presented professional surveys, environmental assessments, and liability protections, everything done by the book. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I walked the land again, tracing the path of the old illegal route. It was peaceful now, just open fields and quiet woods. The storm had passed. My fence stood unchallenged, and for the first time I could imagine this place being more than a battleground. This land had protected me. Now it could protect others. So after a long evening of reflection, I agreed. Not for money, not for leverage, but because it felt right. The emergency route would be built the correct way, with contracts, permits, and respect. But while the community began healing, justice continued tightening its grip around the woman who caused all this. The following Monday, Sarah called with news that left me standing speechless in the middle of my kitchen. The federal grand jury had officially indicted DeLea Kramer on multiple counts: wire fraud, mail fraud, interstate financial conspiracy, embezzlement, falsification of county documents, property damage, tax manipulation, and organized criminal activity. The charges stacked like bricks in a wall she'd built around herself, brick by brick, lie by lie, abuse by abuse. And now the wall was collapsing. That night, I took a slow walk along the fence line, my fence line, watching the security lights blink across the property. For months, the land had been soaked in tension and conflict, but now it felt different, lighter, calmer. The night air was still and cool, carrying the scent of pine and distant creek water. For the first time since I retired, I truly felt like I was home. The war that began with a wrong-colored fence and an entitled woman's arrogance had turned into a reckoning that reshaped an entire community and exposed a criminal network hidden behind suburban civility. And although the biggest blows had been delivered, there was still one chapter left. The final consequences, the courtroom verdicts, the transformation of Willowbrook from a place of fear to a place of rebuilding.
In the months that followed the federal indictment, the world around Willowbrook Estates shifted into a strange duality, part recovery, part reckoning. My land, now ringed with an impenetrable fence and protected by cameras that blinked like watchful stars, grew quieter with each passing week. The chaos that once surged across my property like a tidal wave had receded, leaving behind a landscape free to heal. But while the fields and hills found their peace, the same couldn't be said for the suburban empire that had finally collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. Willowbrook was undergoing the most dramatic transformation in its history. Long-neglected common areas were being restored. Residents who once cowered under the threat of violation letters now walked proudly with a sense of ownership. And the interim board, which had become the backbone of the community, held regular meetings that felt more like town halls than lectures. But woven underneath that quiet reconstruction was the hum of the legal machine, grinding relentlessly forward, gathering momentum as it prepared to draw the final curtain on Delia Kramer's reign. By early spring, courtroom proceedings were in full motion. Federal hearings were typically dry, slow, and technical. But this case was different. The courtroom was packed every session with Willowbrook residents who wanted to see justice unfold. Reporters lined the hallway. Even the judge commented on the unusually high public interest. And while I had no obligation to attend, something inside me felt compelled to witness the end of what had begun with a simple act of defiance on my property line. So on the first day of the pre-trial hearing, I sat quietly in the back row as the prosecution laid out a timeline so thorough it almost felt like watching a documentary unfold in real time. They presented emails, bank statements, manipulated ballots, doctored invoices, secret accounts, contracts signed under pressure, and the infamous fabricated survey maps she'd brandished at me like weapons. They displayed photos of tire tracks across my land, videos of her cutting the chain-link fence, and presented a side-by-side comparison of the 2003 temporary easement next to her forged documents. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Residents, contractors, county employees, and even the poor surveyors she'd tried to drag into her charade. Their stories built a monstrous mosaic of entitlement and fraud. And then came the moment everyone had waited for. The judge ordered the clerk to play the recording from the day she confronted me at the property line, when she confidently, arrogantly, declared her imaginary claim over my land. The courtroom was silent, except for her voice echoing through the speakers, dripping with entitlement, as she pointed toward my fence and claimed established traffic patterns. Then the recording shifted to my voice reading the expired 2003 easement. That single clip acted like a wrecking ball, demolishing every argument she'd crafted. You could feel the mood shift as her authority dissolved in real time. Even the judge's expression softened into something resembling disbelief, like he was astonished someone would build their identity on such blatant lies. Meanwhile, Willowbrook residents continued to rebuild their lives. The new board implemented transparency systems that allowed any homeowner to check financial records online at any time. Budget meetings were live-streamed. Residents voted directly on major decisions. The entire HOA structure had evolved into something healthier than the developers probably imagined when they built the community. And though they still fought over things like fence heights or mailbox designs, the difference was palpable. Respect existed where fear once ruled. But perhaps the most unexpected transformation happened on my 50-acre property. The emergency access route, legally surveyed and properly constructed, became a point of pride for the community. The county installed emergency signage, put in gravel reinforcement, and even added a small access station for fire trucks. It didn't intrude on my peace, and it stood as a testament to what respectful cooperation could accomplish, something that never had been possible under Delia's dictatorship. Outside of emergency use, my land remained untouched, preserved exactly as I wanted it. Throughout this period, I found myself often sitting on the hill overlooking the creek, watching the land flourish again. Deer returned to the edges of the pasture. A pair of hawks nested near the old oak. The air was quieter, cleaner, softer. My retirement, derailed so violently months earlier, had finally settled into something resembling peace. But even in that peace, I knew the final chapter had not yet been written. Justice may move slowly, but it never stops once it has the scent. That chapter came on a warm Friday morning when Sarah called me. I could hear the excitement she failed to suppress. "Verdict's in," she said. "They're reading it this afternoon." I drove to the courthouse, not with anger or anticipation, but with the calm of someone witnessing the conclusion to a long, grueling journey. The courtroom filled quickly, a mix of reporters, residents, and legal observers. When the judge entered, everyone rose, and then the clerk began reading the charges, one after another like stones dropping into water. Guilty on wire fraud. Guilty on mail fraud. Guilty on embezzlement. Guilty on interstate financial manipulation. Guilty on falsifying documents. Guilty on criminal trespassing. Guilty on property damage. Guilty on conspiracy. The list went on, each word echoing like a hammer striking the foundation of her carefully crafted persona. When it was over, the courtroom was completely silent. Even the air seemed to pause. The judge then delivered the sentence: 18 months in federal prison, mandatory restitution to the community, permanent ban from any HOA involvement nationwide, and probationary financial monitoring for 5 years after release. It wasn't a lifetime sentence, but it was enough. More importantly, it stripped her of every tool she had once used to intimidate, manipulate, and control. For a woman whose identity was built on dominance, losing her power was far harsher a punishment than losing her freedom. Months passed quietly after the sentencing. Willowbrook's arrived, my land healed. The scholarship fund, the one created as part of the Emergency Access Agreement, began supporting local students pursuing law and engineering. I received letters from 2 of them thanking me for standing up for what was right. But the truth was, I hadn't done anything extraordinary. I had simply refused to surrender what was mine. And through that stubbornness, a domino effect had unfolded that changed hundreds of lives.